Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll cover the 17th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 25 or Proper 20, which this year falls on September 19th.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So our deep dive for today is on children and childism, in part because of our gospel reading for today. And childism is a term for prejudice against children because they are children. And there's a difference between this and, say, a normal, healthy parental relationship or a normal, healthy teacher-student relationship. Mm-hmm. A person being an authority figure over a child is not necessarily showing them prejudice.
Or discrimination.
But someone who treats children with prejudice and discrimination, who continuously dismisses them, treats them with contempt, that person is showing childism in their behavior.
Yes. We also talked about this a little bit in our Easter.
Yes, and I'd like to say a quick thank you to one of our previous guests from this show, Elle Dowd, for introducing this concept to me personally.
Yep, Elle brought it up in our Easter 4 episode, so we'll link to that episode in our episode description for this episode.
Great. So our common society has been going on a bit of a journey about how do we treat children with love and respect and also kindness during the past couple of generations. My grandparents were very much raised with the outlook of children should be seen and not heard, and that children existed in a fairly small sphere, and that they were still in formation, you might say, and therefore their opinions and thoughts didn't really count outside the sphere of their own personal family, and that they basically weren't quite enough of a person to have opinions that counted. My parents raised me much more in a way that I felt free to have dialogues and conversations with pretty much anybody, but they have both been a little surprised by some of the more recent changes in what's considered appropriate behavior around children, such as particularly the ongoing work that a lot of parents are doing these days regarding making sure that their children are encouraged to understand consent from an extremely young age, toddlers or even infants sometimes, in terms of who's allowed to pick them up, who's allowed to kiss or hold them, and the difference between asking for a hug or demanding a hug at a very young age.
Yeah, I know the 3-year-old in my life, we do a lot of, okay, it's time to say goodbye. And there's an importance of somehow saying goodbye to people, but it could be waving at them. It could be using sign language. It could be hugging. It could be high-fiving.
Sure.
And so that's part of it for how we're navigating it, is you get to decide how you do it, even though we are deciding that it is important to do, because part of it is teaching kind of the norms of our culture and how we want to behave. But I also...
And for that matter, I'm guessing that the adults are also choosing when it's time to go.
For the most part, yeah.
Yes.
I was hanging out with my cousin, and she had a 5-year-old at the time, and every time I put the 5-year-old in her seat and buckled her in, I would say, okay, can I buckle you in now? And at one point she was like, why do you keep asking me that? And I was like, because it's important that you are able to say if you want that or not. And if you want me to do it or your mom, because she needed, it needed to happen no matter what, because we were getting in a car to go somewhere. But it was this little moment where I could interject some, because consent about your body is important and what happens to it. Also in the space of children should be seen and not heard, that connects a lot to labor laws, right? Where children were just there to do work. And kind of, we talk about it as farm families a lot, but it wasn't just farm families that...
Textile factories, glass factories, mines.
Kids were working in a lot of the most dangerous jobs, especially because they were small and nimble and could get in spaces and that sort of thing. And it was the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, of 1938 when they started to actually put in place protections for children's employment and who could and what kinds of jobs and all of that.
Sure.
But I also, one of my favorite t-shirts from a club or anything is my speech and debate team in high school. Senior year, our shirts said, "Children should be seen and heard." And I love that and still have that shirt today.
Excellent.
Also, one of the things that I think it's important to be clear on is we're not saying that children should be taught things just like adults are taught things.
Oh, goodness, no.
We're talking about being age appropriate, right? Age appropriate engagement is important. And there's a distinction between being age appropriate and being dismissive or causing prejudice or discrimination against someone because they're a child.
Yes. One of the things we often wind up talking about when we talk about childism is the difference between child brains and adult brains. Not that you can say that there's one perfect normal child brain and one perfect normal adult brain, because goodness knows that's not true.
Yeah.
But there are some general differences in how a child's brain works and how most adult brains work. And that changes how we present information to people. That changes how we expect people to react to different things. Children are generally more concrete, less aware of the many different options available in the world of how things can go, sometimes very much not aware of long-term consequences. Not that with ADHD I'm particularly great at those either.
Sometimes not aware of their body and the impact that their body has on, like, they're less aware of other people's perspectives as well.
Yes. Empathy is definitely a skill and not a natural inborn talent. And you have to work at it and put effort into it. And children simply haven't been alive that long.
Mm-hmm.
One comment that really jumped out at me that I heard from a bus driver of mine when I was in high school was, she said, the thing about when a child tells you that this is the worst thing that's ever happened to them is that it might be true.
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't know. Like, this literally could be that 4-year-old's worst day of their life, as far as they're concerned. And that's absolutely an option, because they have a much smaller list of days to compare them to. And so all of those things work into how we decide to treat children as adults. And many of them have an effect on things like why we have a minimum voting age in America or in other countries. And I remember when I was about 12, I went through a bit of a phase of being really angry about why the voting age was at 18, and I was a perfectly reasonable person, and why couldn't I vote? And I believe I wrote at least one letter to somebody about that. I don't remember who. And now that I'm an adult, of course, the idea of 12-year-olds voting is a little concerning to me. I am thrilled to talk with them about politics. I am thrilled to educate them about politics or allow them to educate themselves. I am thrilled that they would take an interest and certainly have mock votes and such so that they can get an idea for how the system works. But I'm not sure that I want 12-year-olds helping to decide, say, the state of healthcare in this country. Because, again, much smaller frame of reference.
I mean, that is true, but also I'm going to push back a little bit.
It kind of depends on the 12-year-old.
It depends on the 12-year-old. I think there's ways in which children bring a particular perspective that we need, right? There is a clarity with which they understand and ask things because they don't do the nuance. They don't know the politicking, all of that. It's just like, why wouldn't you make sure that somebody could get to the doctor? But I think also part of childism is, and part of how childism impacts and is impacted by legal voting ages, is that people who are elected officials don't pay attention to anybody unless they can vote, right? For the most part, they're not paying attention. They're not paying attention to immigrants, and they're not paying attention to kids. And when we don't let kids engage, right? So we're not letting them vote until 18. That's after they're out of high school. There's civics classes in high school, and it would be such a gift to have. I do think that the voting age should be lower. I think it should be at least 16. Because then kids can get engaged while they're in high school, and having conversations and debates in their high school classrooms about issues. They can get involved. They'll get responses from elected officials because elected officials will actually be accountable to them. And so then it keeps them more involved instead of waiting until they graduate from high school where there's not that extra incentive to be involved. And they've already had the experience of people not listening to them And so then
Right.
why would they even bother? There's actually a really great West Wing episode about this. I don't remember which episode it is, but there's a group of kids who are advocating for lowering the voting age, and they just get shuttled around from person to person and dismissed, and everybody's like, oh, they just need a tour of the White House. And what they really want is time to advocate for lowering the voting age. And at the end, I think CJ Craig allows one of the kids into the press room for a press conference with the president, and then tells the president, if you want to have fun, or it gives him the hint to call on that student, and that student gets to ask their question and a follow-up of the president, and the president takes their question seriously. And I think that that has been particularly impactful for my own thinking about it. And in some places, they're changing it for at least local elections, for like local mayor and that sort of thing. And I think that's one way to get around the federal requirements, but I think realistically it should be 16 for anybody.
Yeah, I would definitely say that I think that the responsibilities of voting and the responsibility of driving are pretty much on par.
Mm-hmm.
Just in terms of, well, frankly, my first thought, being a harm reduction kind of person, is the level of harm you can do with that, but also the independence and knowledge that you can change your own world. That's massively important.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to the church, one of the things that we often wind up talking about when it comes to children is...
Speaking of the church, though, most congregations I know of have actually, the rule is that in order to vote, you have to be a member, and you can become a member by baptism, but if you're below a certain age, when you go through confirmation, is actually when you become a member. And I remember growing up, the first time I got to vote in the, congregational meeting after I was confirmed, and I proposed a change, and it was very exciting for me.
Yes, a lot of congregations that I know of have done that, and I have really loved watching the kids know that they can get involved. There are some states where anyone under 18 cannot vote on anything regarding money, just legally speaking, and part of that goes back to all of those child labor laws developed after the whole Macaulay Culkin thing that happened when I was little. The idea of allowing a child to decide what adult gets their money basically was discovered to not be a good plan. And so as a result of that, in some states, children can't vote on anything in an organization that involves money. It's kind of a circuitous track of how you get there, but it does essentially make sense. But yes, I do love that children can be involved in the decisions of the congregation that way. Another way that we often wind up talking about children in church is, are we talking about children as though they are allowed to attend worship and that that is a privilege that they have that can be taken away depending on their behavior and whether it meets certain, usually elderly people's standards? I only say that because I have literally never been in a congregation where the people complaining about the kids are younger than like 65. The people younger than that are usually just thrilled to see any children in the building. Or, opposed to that, do you have worship that is actually designed for children to get something out of it, like, say, children's bulletins that help explain what's going on and stuff like that? And one way that I've heard children talked about in church is actually from my colleague, Pastor Kelly France. Are children window dressing in the church, or are they members? Are children decorations that you have to prove that you're a good church and you're good at being church, and therefore they exist as literally decorations in your building that, you know, happen to walk and talk, and some of them can dress themselves? Or are they actual members who are involved and active and listened to and valued?
Yeah, that's a particularly poignant juxtaposition. Neither of us are saying that a congregation has to do it perfectly, but there are lots of different ways to
no such thing.
Yeah, to make worship for children. And I grew up, as Kay mentioned, with a children's bulletin, and we actually went downstairs after communion during the sermon. We had a children's time and a children's bulletin, and then we went downstairs for Sunday school for the second half of worship while everybody else had the sermon. That worked well for us as a congregation. But there are also more intentional ways of making sure that worship is for children. One of the ones that I love the most is actually from Trinity Lutheran Church of Manhattan on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It is a bilingual congregation. They might actually be trilingual at this point, and they actually have a specific worship that's called We Worship. So kids are definitely welcome in any of the worship services, but there's one service that is explicitly designed to center kids.
And not sponsored by Nintendo, just to be clear.
Not sponsored by Nintendo. It is We, W-E-E, and has been in existence since before the other
Awesome.
We. So they have one sheet of laminated paper that has some of the songs that they sing, and they're like simpler kid Sunday school camp songs.
Sure.
They read the scripture, but they might not read all of the scriptures that they read for the other worship services. And they do the sermon with like puppets, Gabby and Sandy. And there's like a blanket that everybody spreads out and puts down and then sits on the blanket together. Communion is for everybody, and so the kids are the ones who are helping serve communion and the ones receiving it. I haven't kept tabs to see what they're doing during the pandemic so much.
Yeah.
But the way that they do worship is just such a gift and so intentional for kids. It is geared towards a kid's age when they're not at a place where an hour and a half long service is going to be something that they can handle. And so that
Sure.
space is just a beautiful opportunity that they created, and I really love that.
Yeah, I grew up in a somewhat different setting than you did, in that we did have children's bulletins. By bulletin, I mean they didn't actually have the service information. They had some information about what the readings were and some pictures and puzzles and things. Then there was also the regular bulletin, and my family made sure that I understand how the bulletin worked. Like they explicitly taught me, this is this part and this is where that goes and that kind of thing. Which, if those of you who are listening who are not familiar with the Lutheran Church, it usually involves juggling a hymnal, a bulletin, sometimes a Bible, and possibly some bulletin inserts. So that got kind of complicated. The basics I probably had down too, by the time I was 8. Yeah, well, I would love it if my church had done that. I'm not really sure they did. But so we had Sunday school between the two services, and if I was going to church, it almost certainly was the late service. And so I would go to Sunday school first and then go to church. And the gift of being a ADHD kid who is at least partly the inattentive type and not just the hyperactive type is that I could daydream my way through a service no problem. So I was beautifully behaved. But also, my grandparents made sure that I had a hymnal I could look through, I had a Bible I could look through, and I always had plenty of fresh paper and a pencil, so I could doodle all I wanted. And that got me through plenty of church services pretty well, although I don't remember any from before I was like 6 or so, because we did also have a nursery for kids who just couldn't sit through the service yet. So
I really appreciate it. I also got access to the hymnal and the bulletin and stuff when I was a kid because I was interested and engaged. And my home congregation has a ton of visitors because it's in a resort town. And so during the ski season and even during the summer season, there's just a lot of visitors. We have one of the best time slots in the Interfaith Chapel. And so they're used to explaining it. So the bulletin does have inserts, but it's a pretty simple, here's the list and the pages, and then it's page number this in the front of your hymnal, and hymn number this in the back of your hymnal. But each piece is announced too, which helps visitors, but it also helps kids to make the connections, especially if they're not of the age where they can read yet. And they're just like kind of following along and learning what it looks like to follow along.
Yeah, and on that note, I would throw in there that as much as we expect literacy in our society, those announcements are handy for a lot more people than you might expect. Dyslexia and other learning disabilities exist, and so if you are good at helping the children through the service, you are probably also helping some adults.
Yeah. I mean, even as a pulpit supply, sometimes I'm like,
oh goodness, yes.
No.
And for that matter, I have extremely thick glasses, and the tiny type that people love to use is... There is also a thing called godly play that I know is popular in many congregations and is often used as a part of a Sunday school curriculum. I don't personally know a ton about how it works because I've never been part of a congregation that's been able to try it, because it takes a certain amount of commitment from the get-go. But I do know that it involves allowing the kids to have a setup in the Sunday school room that resembles a small altar and the front of the church, and they get to go through the service on their own and worship together. And very often it also involves them practicing things that they will get to do themselves, possibly when they're just a little older and a little bit steadier about holding large objects like those trays that we hold the communion cups on.
I was thinking candles, but also, yeah.
Yes, also candles. I honestly, though, to be strictly honest with you, I think the best people to hold candles in this world are the kids between the ages of about 2 and 5.
That's true.
Because they are so deeply careful with it, and they are so worried about getting anything wrong. And it's everybody older than that who are just really dangerous
that is
with
true.
fire.
Yeah. I also don't have a lot of experience with godly play. I've seen it a couple times, and it
sounds wonderful.
Somewhat like you've said, but also some people who just use it for the children's time in the middle of worship. But there is this pause and welcoming and inviting. And the thing that sticks with me for godly play is there's an invitation to wonder together. So there's like telling the story, and there's different pieces that you use to tell the story so that there's a visual thing. But also then it's wondering together and inviting kids to participate in that part, which I think is a beautiful thing. And that's a gift of intergenerational worship for a variety of reasons, is that kids have some amazing questions and insights, and they have ways of putting things into perspective that adults would really benefit from. Yes.
And I think one of the favorite things that I've seen of godly play is that some of the accessories that are usually involved are little tiny children-sized stoles, so that the kids can pretend that they are the pastor for the day. And I love being able to allow them to imagine themselves in that role, because even if when they grow up, if they decide they don't want to be a pastor, it still lets them ask, how can I be God to these people? How can I help bring God into the lives of these people? How can I speak the gospel to these people? How can I be Christian in life? You know, that kind of thing.
And how can
that
God
is so
work
valuable
through me? Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's great. I never had that opportunity, and for a long time, it didn't even cross my mind that I could be a pastor, mostly because of gender stuff. But it wasn't until college that shifted, because I saw people who looked more like me as pastors. But I wonder what it would have been like if I had been able to try on a stole at some point.
Yeah, I know that I knew that women pastors were a thing as a child, but I didn't actually meet one for quite a while, maybe high school. My church, there were other Lutheran churches in town and other churches in town we occasionally did stuff with, but that didn't mean that I went, because my parents were divorced and I also lived in another town, so yeah.
Another way of incorporating kids in worship that can be really meaningful is something that's called a playground. There's actually a lot of different names, but the first time I heard of it as a playground, as opposed to
I love
playground.
the pun.
And I also love the pun. But the idea is to have a space in the sanctuary where kids can be, ideally up front.
Yes, please.
When it's in the back, it makes no sense, because then it really is just to occupy kids so they don't get in the way of worship, because kids are smaller than adults by and large. And so if you put kids in the back, they're not going to be able to see. But if you have a playground up in the front of the sanctuary, kids are more able to see what's going on, and so engage more fully in that sense. There can be little tables and chairs that kids can sit at. You can have coloring supplies there so that they can color while worship is happening. If families want, they can all sit up in the playground area. I know some places that have rocking chairs, particularly for people who are nursing or whose babies just need lots of extra snuggles and rocking. But having them intentionally set towards the front gives the kids the space to be important in worship and to be more engaged in worship, because they can see what's going on, they can hear what's going on, they don't have to duck around people's heads or legs.
Yeah. I have been working for some time in my head about how you could have a playground that was in a church balcony, like take the half wall of a balcony, replace it with glass so that the kids could see, make sure there's lots of binoculars and stuff up there, make sure they can hear, and that way they're safe, they have their own space. And I mean, when I was a kid, I would have loved to be up on top over the congregation, but still be able to see everything. That absolutely would have helped, because I have known so many congregations where the balcony is really no longer used and is just kind of abandoned, and that could give the balcony a useful life, while also not taking away space for people who, say, have mobility issues and can't make it up to the balcony to still have space to sit downstairs. But I haven't quite been able to work that out, because every time I think about that, I just keep thinking of all the things that me as a little kid would have absolutely thrown over that little half wall of glass down at the congregation. So I can see how there could be some issues with that. But,
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's tricky, and there's some space to balance needs, but a lot of congregations also have the extra room or aren't using the front pews anyway.
Yes. I have actually learned that it's not just Lutherans who sit in the back. Sometimes the Presbyterians do too.
I always sat in the front. I always wanted to sit in the very front row because I was that kid.
Yes, that does not surprise me at all, somehow. And then if there is one thing, if there is one comment about children and church that I could hope that you would take away from this with you, it's if you do still have some children in church, but there are not as many as you would like, please, for the entirely literal love of God, do not complain to the children you have about how they aren't enough or how there aren't enough of them.
Yeah. Or that there aren't any. I mean, even as a young adult, I have heard a number of times that there aren't any young adults in worship. There aren't any kids in worship, while there are kids right there.
Yeah. Let me tell you, I was one of those kids who got those complaints when I was a little kid, and I don't go back to that congregation now. I don't have I have a few fond memories of that place, but that did not help my relationship with the church at all.
Yeah, for sure. Do better. Know better, do better. That's what we're here for, at least today in this episode.
But hey, we'll be getting to James pretty soon, so don't worry. There's more.
I think today, in fact.
Yeah.
As we dive into our readings for this episode, our first reading is Jeremiah chapter 11, verses 18 through 20. The prophet is shown by God the evils of the people who are plotting against him, and he hopes to see God's retribution against them. So one of the themes in this is betrayal. Jeremiah is being betrayed by the people in an unexpected, unanticipated way. And it reminded me of the show Sense8, which I just marathoned a couple weeks ago while I was somewhat sick. And part of it, there is one person in one of the clusters who betrays the entire cluster, which is particularly hard and painful because a cluster is people who are all linked kind of telepathically, but it's like all of their senses are linked. So they feel and think. They're your own unique people, but they can feel and think with each other and be present with each other.
Sure.
And so that space of to be betrayed by that person is even greater because they're so connected that it's hard to imagine them betraying and being able to keep that secret because there aren't really secrets. But then also there's such an intimate connection that the betrayal feels so much more painful.
Yeah.
But yeah. And then in verse 19, so both Kay and I did all of our connections for verse 19, the first half of the verse and the last half of the verse, and skipped the middle.
It's a good
half
verse.
Of the verse. But so the first part that I connected with was the comment from the prophet, but I was like a gentle lamb led to the slaughter. And that reminded me of Leah in An Ember in the Ashes, especially at the beginning where she was led by the resistance into the service of the commandant who had killed her mother. But it was basically being taken into the lion's den. Nobody was planning for her to live from that encounter. She did, but... yeah.
Well, that's how young adult novels often work.
I mean, that is true. That is true. And she really was. Like, she had not been involved in the resistance at all until
Sure.
her brother got arrested by The commandant's mask.
Yeah, I read that half of the verse, and I have to be honest, my first thought was an internet meme from last year, I guess, or I suppose the last few years, I guess I've seen it online, which is the leopards eating people's faces party, which I have seen several memes for, but the most common is, "I didn't know they were going to eat my face," said the president of the leopards eating people's faces party. And yeah, so many parallels to so many things going on in real life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen the meme, but that is hilarious. And very
yeah, and then the second half of "Let us cut him off from the land of the living, so that his name will no longer be remembered." And this immediately brought to mind for me Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, a series of books. And in one of them, Going Postal, there is the creation of this sort of internet-ish thing, except it's very analog, not digital at all. And it's called the Clacks. And it's basically a way to communicate between towns. And it's sort of, if you took the telegraph and tried to turn that into a way that you could send not just short messages, but also whole books. And eventually they figure out how to transmit pictures in much the same way that they used to transmit pictures over fax machines. And they don't really go into the technical part of how it works. But one of the things that happens that in the book is that the creator of the Clacks, John Deerhart, his son is murdered. And so after this happens, because he doesn't know who did it, and so he can't get justice for his son, he put a piece of code into the Clacks that was called GNU John Deerhart. And the letters at the beginning, G meant that the message must be passed on. N means not logged. You don't write down that you sent the message through. And U means that the message should be turned around at the end of the line to come back again. And so basically what this meant was that he was sending his son's name through the Clacks again and again, over and over, forever. And that basically, therefore, his son's name would always be spoken by the Clacks, if not by anyone else. And this was because, as Terry Pratchett is famous for putting it, a man is not dead while his name is still spoken. And because of that book, since Terry Pratchett died a few years ago, and honestly, for a while before his death, while he was dealing with Alzheimer's, there has been an online meme of every so often someone will type GNU Terry Pratchett. And then that will be repeated many, many times to remember his name. So I've appreciated that as a way of remembering the dead. Especially, I think it's meaningful for people who aren't especially religious. So.
Yeah. When I read that same part of the verse, it reminded me of the Jewish tradition, which I think a lot of, especially Christians, learned about last year when Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Ginsburg, died. So Christian tradition, a lot of the times we say rest in peace or rest in power, depending. And Jewish tradition, instead, they say, may your memory be for a blessing. And so that concept of so that the prophet's name will no longer be remembered is in direct contrast to that, right? That we want the prophet's name to be remembered, that we want that memory to be for a blessing. I particularly enjoyed the ways that that shifted a little bit last year, where it was, may your memory be for a revolution, for a resistance, for a blessing. There are many ways that we can kind of bless memories.
Yes, absolutely. Our second reading for today is from James, chapter 3, verse 13 through chapter 4, verse 3, and chapter 4, verses 7 through 8a. The author reminds us that envy and selfishness do not come from wisdom, but that God draws near to us to lead us away from our base impulses.
So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of greed versus grace, that the author is kind of pushing people away from greed, away from the impulses connected to greed, and pushing them towards the grace and the generosity that comes with it. And so it reminded me of the conflict in Divergent between the erudite who prize knowledge above all else, and that leads them into a greed for power, and the abnegation who prize selflessness or generosity to others above all else. So that leads them to not fighting back necessarily when they end up getting attacked. But both of those are limited when compared to the divergent brain that can hold a selflessness and a desire for knowledge that's not just a thirst for power. Because erudite and the thirst for knowledge at its best is not a thirst for power, is not about greed, but that's how it's been twisted. Right. And so returning it back to a thirst for knowledge that can then be used to help others makes a huge difference. Mm-hmm. And then as we dive into the verses, in chapter 3, verse 14, we read, "But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be boastful and false to the truth." And that felt like a pretty good challenge for Loki.
That might take him a few dozen centuries to master, yeah.
You know, Loki, both in the general Marvel Cinematic Universe and in the show Loki, which I'm only partway through, but that idea of bitter envy and selfish ambition, like, yeah, the god of mischief is, definitely leaning into the envy and ambition and selfish ambition and boastfulness and false truth. So this is a passage for Loki, I suppose.
And perhaps the Slytherins?
Perhaps, indeed.
In chapter 3, verse 17, we read, "But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy." So, if somebody is telling you that a certain course of action is the wise choice, but it just involves the death of a few people or that kind of person, but don't worry about that, then according to the Bible, that is not the wise choice according to God. So many young adult fictional dystopias could have been avoided if they had paid attention to this verse. Assuming that the Bible exists in those universes to begin with, I suppose. But, which is not always true. Mm-hmm. Also, probably some modern-day real-life dystopias could have been avoided.
Yes. Anything that is going to kill a few people. I mean, we just got out of a war in Afghanistan. And that is a perfect example.
Let's be entirely honest. It's not like I don't understand at least a little bit of the impulse, because, by golly, I've been angry too. But, no, you are not actually allowed to set people on fire. That is not how the world works, even if you can do it only with the power of your mind.
Yeah.
Which, I still kind of want to learn that trick, because being able to light candles from a distance would be handy. But, no, don't do it.
Yeah. And then in chapter 4, verse 2, we read, "You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflict." And this reminded me of the Hunger Games prequel, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which is President Cornelius Snow's kind of backstory. And you can see as he progresses through this, it takes place, I think, over the course of about 6 months to a year. But as he progresses through it, he, gets into a relationship with someone, and he thinks he loves her, and it appears to be, so it's not actually mutual, but he thinks of it more as mutual until it's not. Until he wants power, until he gets greedy, and then it's okay if somebody gets murdered. It's okay if a fight starts. It's okay if something happens, as long as he gets what he wants.
Yeah.
Who we know him to be in his later years, too.
Yeah, because we both have such excellent taste in Bible verses, and also possibly we've been doing this for a while. I also read that part of the verse, and gracious. So biblical examples for this include King David about Bathsheba, and Ahab and Jezebel about that one vineyard, and of course Cain and Abel about, Cain and Abel. Mm-hmm. And fictional and real life examples, so many examples. And not just the evil overlord types, but also the people who don't really have that much power and are willing to do nearly anything to be able to get more. Mm-hmm. One of the first things that comes to mind for me is some of the characters in Oliver Twist, who Oliver meets, who initially seem to be pretty kind and helpful to Oliver, and then he finds out, no, not really. He was just useful to them. So.
Yeah, or I think the thing that popped into my head was the way that capitalism and racism combined to tell poor white folks, you are entitled to this thing. And it's Black people in particular, and people of color more broadly, who are keeping you from getting that thing. And so the disputes and conflicts happened, even though up at the top are the folks who are controlling everybody and everybody's finances. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Our gospel reading for this episode is Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. Jesus continues to teach the disciples that he will be executed and rise again, but they don't understand. When their ambition leads them to argue, Jesus invites them to become servants to each other and to be welcoming to the powerless, such as little children. So one of the themes for this passage is the call to those with power to be humble. And I could think of no better example than Harry Potter at the very end of Deathly Hallows, when he and Voldemort have both been in the Forbidden Forest and not died, and then they're in the Great Hall and they're circling each other, and Harry just keeps calling to Voldemort and inviting him to repent, to be remorseful for all of the people he's killed, because that's the only way for his soul to get back together. And he just keeps inviting him to that, and ultimately Voldemort, declines the invitation. But there is this is the way forward. This is the possibility that you have for life. And then it just is not the one that Voldemort chooses.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of a conversation I had with a friend once where they asked me, if you could convince a politician to say anything to the world, or if there's any one thing you want to hear from a politician, what is it? And I said, honestly, I don't want to hear more from the politicians. I want them to listen. I want them to listen to people more, and not necessarily to me, but definitely to the people that I've been listening to. And that calling power to be humble, that's part of what that is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Or I think I would have answered with, I was wrong, and this is what I've learned and what I'm doing differently.
That would be great, yes. That's an excellent option.
I want them to say, yeah. And then as we dive into the verses, in verse 32, we read, "But they, the disciples, did not understand what Jesus was saying and were afraid to ask him." And that's a big premise in dystopias, is having rules that can't be challenged. But in particular, I was thinking about the Matched trilogy, which is a young adult dystopia trilogy where society has this algorithm and structure that matches people up with their perfect match, and it is not to be questioned ever, even when things don't make sense. Like, for example, two different people showing up as your match when you receive your match. But that then, like, when questions start to happen, it's shut down really quickly, that there's not room because people are afraid to ask because harm happens when asking. Granted, the fear of asking at this point is not because Jesus is going to destroy them or banish them, but...
No. Well, and speaking of that, so I read this verse, and again, Emily and I have been doing this for a while, and we both have great taste in Bible verses, and again, we both talked about the same verses for this reading, too.
Yeah, this episode is a lot of synchronization between our verse choices.
We may spend a little time next week trying not to do that.
Yeah.
But I read this verse, and I just wanted to say a heads up to the neurodivergent, or those of you who may not realize that you're neurodivergent yet, having been in that seat myself a couple of years ago, before I was diagnosed with ADHD. I did not know this before I started learning more about not just my ADHD and how it manifests in various people, but also like how the neurodivergent brain works and how that has an effect on your social life and your interactions with others. But this is actually a super common reaction, the whole not wanting to ask questions when you're not sure what the answer should be. And it boils down to the fear of appearing ignorant, uneducated, or foolish. And it is especially a super common reaction among both people with ADHD who may have, missed a few words of a couple of your sentences here and there as you were talking to them, and who have trouble paying attention to what they're supposed to be paying attention to when they're supposed to be paying attention to it. And also among grown-up former gifted kids who were taught often to avoid appearing ignorant of pretty much anything at nearly any cost from a very young age.
That was me. That was 1,000,000% me.
Yeah, that was me too. And it's not that the adults around me, for the most part, were trying to teach me that either. Most of them wanted me to ask questions. Most of them liked it when I asked questions. But there were still some questions that didn't feel like I was supposed to ask. And I'm just going to say that having been in this situation and not having wanted to ask the questions many, 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 many times myself, 99.99999% of the time, I will say that just biting the bullet and asking the question is very rarely as apocalyptic as we might expect it to be. Mm-hmm. We have a tendency to build that kind of thing up in our minds, and it becomes impossible, but it's really not.
Mm-hmm. And it's really likely that somebody else also has that question and is afraid to ask it.
Yes, and it's also perfectly likely that the reason why you have that question is because they forgot to tell you that. I once spent 3 weeks looking for a vacuum cleaner without asking anyone where it was because I was convinced that I had just missed someone telling me where it was. And no, they had just straight up forgotten to tell me where they kept the vacuum cleaner. So just please ask, because not asking the question can very often lead you to more difficult problems. Probably even more difficult than just not being able to vacuum your floor. But
for sure.
That's just my own personal perfect example of, no, just ask the question. And then in verse 37, Jesus says, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me but the one who sent me." So we talked about this a fair bit in our earlier deep dive about especially the church welcoming children, but also, other people welcoming children. There's welcoming a child, and then there's truly welcoming a child. And for example, technically speaking, you could say that the Dursleys welcomed Harry Potter into their home after his parents died. Technically. Is that a good example of how to welcome a child into your home? No. Don't do that. If they want to explore the cupboard under the stairs occasionally, make sure there's no knives or like poisonous spiders or something in there, and then maybe. But don't make them sleep in there. That's not how this works.
Yeah, no, definitely not. I also looked at that verse, and the thing that came to mind for me was welcome a child, but not welcome children in the sense of The Handmaid's Tale, which is welcoming children at the expense of the people carrying the fetuses to term.
Yeah.
Different kind of welcome.
So many comments, but
welcome children without, harming the people carrying the fetuses. Don't force the children to come into existence.
And in a desperately hope more realistic for everyday life kind of example, just don't welcome children at the expense of the people who come along with them. Like the number of times that I have been asked as a pastor to, you have to go visit this new family. They just moved to town. They have 5 kids. We need their children. Go get them. Maybe not exactly phrased that way, but it sounds like you're asking me to, drag the children with me and not care about what the parents want. And that's not okay. Don't do that. No.
You can, in fact, care about all of the people in the family.
Yes. And even if maybe they have a grandma who can be friends with you or something, just don't treat children like they're a commodity. That's, People aren't things.
Truth.
I really should see that Mad Max movie, but yeah.
Yeah, and that goes for, Handmaid's Tale and Texas.
Or, for that matter, the rest of the country or world or universe.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 18th Sunday after Pentecost with our special guest, Pastor Lisa Heffernan. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our full guest episodes and interviews, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope that Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that. Though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said, Pax Vobiscum.